In the summer of 2023, one of the 6 artists who were invited to participate in the very first exhibition of outdoor art on Washington, D.C.'s National Mall contributed this playground. Both sides of its central wall were covered by large archival photographs of then recently desegregated Washington playgrounds. As I visited this installation and realized that the kids at play were a key part of the work of art, I started thinking about how, over the centuries, artistic representations of childhood matched the reality of being a child. In the 18th century, most kids grew up in the countryside where, as soon as they were able-bodied, they joined grown-ups working the fields. Kids were viewed as little adults, a view that percolated up to the upper classes, whose children were portrayed dressed like adults, exuding a precocious confidence. Society paid so little attention to childhood that artists captured it, for the most part, allegorically. But toward the end of the 18th century, under the influence of thinkers like Jean-Jacques Rousseau, society started to recognize that childhood was a distinct stage of life. By the 19th century, paintings evoked the boundary that separates childhood from adulthood. This laborer put down his shovel and interrupted his work to watch his child's first steps, while this grandfather, to pay attention to his grandchild, glances away from his newspaper's headlines. As for children, they could choose to turn questions like where, how, and why into a game of hide and seek, or ask these very questions with the pointedness that solitude encourages. The boy in the center of this painting seems to be trying to make sense of a social order that leaves an old man so destitute that he must play music on the streets to support his family. Many 19th century children had good reason to question the social order, because in the same period when painters were portraying them blissfully living in a kind of utopia, children were living one of the darkest chapters in the history of childhood, as the Industrial Revolution now enlisted them to work in factories or in mines. If a child survived these inhumane conditions, which many did not, it was not to look back on a happy childhood, but on a life sentence of adulthood. In the 20th century, one psychologist realized that the development of the child is tied to the development of mankind as a whole. Society responded. School became mandatory. Child labor was abolished. The justices of the United States Supreme Court, who in 1954 unanimously ordered the desegregation of schools, no doubt understood that the development of their country answered to the development of its children. The 20th century could indeed be called the century of the child, as its artists celebrated the creativity of children, their playfulness, their ability to invent their own games, their uninhibited curiosity. Once artists shifted from figuration toward abstraction, their youthful scribbles mingled with their adult scrawls. Looking back, the outlook of a child infused the postmodernism of the 1980s and 90s, the modernism of the 70s, and the pop art of the 60s. And though the brazenness of the childish gaze could be disturbing to some, didn't it simply confirm what Jean-Jacques Rousseau stated 2 centuries ago? We will never fully fathom the thoughts of children. Yet, if the 20th century was the century of the child, the 21st century is shaping to be the revenge of the adults, with their unbreakable rules, like book bans for schools, or the denial of the right for children to choose their preferred gender. It's as though society forgot the lesson of the 20th century, that in order for a creative breakthrough to happen in school, it's just as necessary for teachers to enforce a rule as it is for students to break it. In the 20th century, depictions of the difficult conditions of children were designed to elicit compassion. 21st century adults are treating children as mere instruments of their own politics. Today's children are being subjected to so many pressures that they are being called the anxious generation. This anxiety is reflected in contemporary art, like this work, where it looks like the anxiety of the school kids was so acute that it's making the legs of their school chairs high-strung. Or like this work, where to the coloring books handed out by courts to kids to help them understand legal proceedings, the artist added the frantic scribbles of a child. But contemporary art also shows how kids remain resilient and capable of reinvention. This series of photographs followed a young Bosnian refugee over the years as she adapted to life in her new country. This series of films showed children around the world playing games of their own invention, like this kid in the Congo who got inside a tire and rolled himself down a hillside of cobalt slab. For a few weeks, last summer's playground also enabled kids to make a playful incursion into a space that is usually considered serious adult territory, the National Mall. By creating space for kids to play, this work reminded us that children too have rights. Rights whose protection under the United States Constitution would just require tweaking the text of its Second Amendment to state, well-nurtured children being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of kids to reinvent themselves should not be infringed.